The paper smacked against my desk so hard it made my coffee cup jump. I looked up to find Brenda looming over me. Her polished fingertips were still pressed into the contract, like she was trying to sear it into the wood. "Sign this non-compete, or I'll blacklist you in 48 countries. Your career will be finished." Her voice was pure frost. I have connections everywhere. I stared at the paperwork. 5 years of my life flashed through my mind. 5 years of building our international division out of nothing. 5 years of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, crashing in airport lounges, learning Mandarin and Portuguese and Arabic, because I refused to depend on translators while closing deals. 5 years of crafting something remarkable while she sat in her corner office collecting every ounce of recognition. My hands didn't shake as I reached for the pen. "You're right," I said, locking eyes with her. "Connections matter more than anything." Hi everyone, I'm Evelyn. I'm 34, and I'm about to share how I turned the lowest moment of my career into the sweetest triumph of my life. Before I go any further though, please take a moment to tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if any part of this hits home, please tap that like button and subscribe for more stories just like this. Trust me, you're going to want to hear the ending. Let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand what I built before you can understand what she tried to tear apart. I joined this global consulting firm straight out of business school. Nothing glamorous, just ambition and a need to prove myself. They placed me on their international expansion efforts, which at the time meant maybe 3 countries and a whole lot of optimism. I threw myself into the work completely. While my coworkers were socializing at happy hours, I was on calls with potential partners in Singapore at 2 a.m. While they enjoyed weekend brunches, I was flying to Sao Paulo to meet manufacturers who could help us build supply chains that didn't even exist yet. The workload was unforgiving, but I loved it. Every new market we entered felt like conquering a summit. Every connection I formed felt lasting, built on trust and genuine understanding rather than contracts and profit lines. Brenda became my supervisor 2 years in. She had been brought in from outside specifically to manage international growth. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now supervising the very operation I had built myself. At first, she seemed sincerely impressed by what I'd accomplished. She asked detailed questions about our partners, our systems, our important contacts. I was naive enough to believe she wanted to help me advance. But then I began noticing patterns. During client meetings, she would pitch strategies I had created as if they were her own ideas. When we secured major deals, her name always appeared first on internal announcements. When trade publications asked for someone to interview about our global success, it was somehow always Brenda who ended up quoted. The breaking point came during our expansion into African territories. I had spent 8 months cultivating relationships with suppliers and regulatory leaders across 6 countries. The work demanded cultural awareness and patience you simply cannot fake. When we finally secured a massive contract positioning us as the dominant player in the region, Brenda arranged a presentation to the board. She invited me to attend, which I foolishly thought meant I would finally get recognition. Instead, I sat in the back of that conference room, watching her present my research, my strategies, my partnerships as her own vision. She spoke about her approach to global expansion and her grasp of international markets. Not once did she say my name. Afterward, the board congratulated her on her innovative thinking. They celebrated her for creating such a thriving international division. They even discussed promoting her to vice president. I felt invisible. Worse than invisible. I felt erased. That's when I started recording everything. Every email I sent, every call I made, every relationship I nurtured. I built a detailed record of exactly who had done what. Not because I had a plan yet, but because I needed proof for myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The industry began to take notice of our international achievements. Conference organizers invited us to speak at major gatherings, Trade magazines wanted to highlight our expansion strategies, and every single time, it was Brenda who stepped into the limelight. I watched her deliver presentations about markets she had never visited, relying on insights she never developed, discussing relationships she never built, and she was convincing. She had learned the language well enough to speak with authority about work she had never done. Meanwhile, I was becoming a ghost within my own operation. New hires were told that Brenda was the genius behind our international success, and clients who had worked directly with me were now redirected to communicate through Brenda's office. I was being systematically erased from the story of my own accomplishments, but I kept going, kept building, because I truly believed that excellence would eventually be noticed. I thought that if I just performed at an even higher level, if I delivered even more impressive results, the truth would become undeniable. I was so wrong. Then the opportunity came through a headhunter. A smaller consulting firm specializing in emerging markets was looking for someone to lead their expansion into Asia. The position was perfect for me, combining everything I had learned with the chance to finally earn the recognition I deserved. The interview process was incredible. For the first time in years, I was sitting across from people who wanted to hear about my actual experiences, my real insights, my genuine expertise. They had done their homework and knew exactly what I had achieved, regardless of whose name appeared officially. When they offered me the role, I didn't accept immediately. I wanted to give Brenda a chance to counteroffer, to finally acknowledge my worth to the company, hoping that this external validation would force her to see what she was about to lose. I requested a meeting and explained the situation candidly, told her about the offer, and said I hoped we could discuss my career path within the company. Her response was swift and devastating. "Evelyn, I think you're overestimating your contribution to our international operations. Yes, you've been involved in implementation, but the strategic vision and relationship management has always come from my level. If another company wants to hire you for basic operational work, that's entirely your choice. Basic operational work. 5 years of my life dismissed as basic operational work." I asked for time to consider my options, and that's when I made the mistake of telling her exactly what the other company had offered me, including the title and scope of responsibility. Her entire demeanor shifted. The dismissive superiority was replaced by something far more dangerous. She realized another company valued me far more than she had pretended, and that terrified her. "Evelyn, before you make any rash decisions, you should know that your employment contract includes some very specific restrictions regarding competition and client relationships. I'd hate for you to find yourself in legal trouble." I had read my contract when I signed it 5 years earlier, but that night I pulled it out and studied every word. The non-compete clause was broad but standard, barring me from working for direct competitors for 1 year and from soliciting our clients for 18 months. I thought I could operate within those limits. The offer was from a different type of firm serving different markets, so there shouldn't have been any conflict. But Brenda had other ideas. 3 days later, she called me into her office and slammed the contract onto my desk. "This is a revised non-compete agreement," she said, "much more comprehensive than your original contract, reflecting the sensitive nature of the international relationships you've been exposed to." I read it quickly. The restrictions were insane. Not 1 year, but 3. Not just direct competitors, but any company in the same markets. Not just soliciting clients, but having any professional contact with anyone in our network. "This isn't legally enforceable," I said. "Maybe not in court," she replied. "But I don't need a court to ruin your career. I have ties with every major firm in this industry across 6 continents. One call from me and doors stop opening, references vanish, opportunities disappear." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sign this non-compete or I'll blacklist you in 48 countries. Your career will be over. I have connections everywhere." That's when I picked up the pen and said the words that would change everything. "You're right. Connections are everything." Because as I signed that absurd contract, I realized something Brenda had completely missed. Yes, she had connections, but I had relationships. For 5 years, while she took credit for my work, I had been building genuine trust with partners, suppliers, and clients around the world. They recognized my voice on late-night calls when crises erupted, my problem-solving style when deals seemed impossible, and who truly understood their markets, their challenges, and their goals. Brenda had her name on the organizational chart and her business cards in expensive holders, but I had something far more valuable: respect earned through competence and consistency. I signed her contract without argument and then submitted my resignation, effective immediately. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm taking some time to think about my next steps," I said. "Exactly 90 days, actually. That's the mandatory cooling-off period specified in this contract." Her smile was satisfied, almost predatory. She thought she had won. For the next 3 months, I disappeared completely from the industry. I didn't attend conferences, didn't take meetings, didn't respond to professional inquiries. To anyone watching, it looked like Brenda had successfully ended my career. But I wasn't idle. I was planning. I spent those 90 days studying the contract I had signed with obsessive detail. Every word, every clause, every possible interpretation. I consulted 3 different employment lawyers, not to break the agreement, but to understand precisely what I could and couldn't do within its terms. What I discovered was fascinating. The contract was designed to prevent me from competing with my former employer or working with their clients, but it said nothing about creating entirely new categories of service that hadn't existed when it was written. I also spent those 90 days reconnecting with relationships I had built outside our immediate client base: vendors, suppliers, industry associations, regulatory bodies, academic institutions, people who knew my work but weren't covered by any contractual restrictions. And I researched and studied emerging trends in international business, new technologies reshaping global commerce, and regulatory changes creating opportunities and challenges most consulting firms hadn't even noticed yet. By day 89, I had a complete business plan for something that had never existed before: not a consulting firm competing with my former employer, but an advisory service addressing problems the traditional consulting industry couldn't handle. On day 91, I filed the paperwork to establish my own company. I called it Global Insight Advisory, specializing in helping companies navigate the increasingly complex intersection of technology, regulation, and cultural adaptation in international markets. We weren't management consultants. We weren't implementation specialists. We were strategic advisors for challenges that fell between the cracks of traditional services. The timing was perfect. While I had been building conventional international operations for my former employer, the world had been changing rapidly: new trade agreements, emerging technologies, shifting regulatory landscapes, evolving cultural expectations. The old playbook was becoming obsolete, but most consulting firms were too invested in their existing approaches to adapt. I, on the other hand, had spent 90 days doing nothing but studying these changes and designing solutions. My first client came through a contact I had made 2 years earlier at an international trade conference. He was the head of strategic planning for a technology company struggling to expand into Southeast Asian markets. They had hired 2 consulting firms and weren't getting results. The problem wasn't their strategy or implementation. The problem was that they were approaching 21st century markets with 20th century thinking. They needed someone who understood both traditional business fundamentals and the emerging realities reshaping international commerce. Our 3-month engagement was so successful, they immediately hired us for expansion into African markets, then referred us to 2 other companies facing similar challenges. Word spread quickly through networks I had been building for years. Not official business networks where Brenda held influence, but the informal relationships between people who actually did the work: project managers, regional directors, implementation specialists, technical experts, the people who knew, who really solved problems. and who just took credit for solutions. Within 6 months, Global Insight Advisory had 12 clients across 4 continents. We were profitable from month 3 and were already turning down projects because we couldn't keep up with demand. But the real victory came when the industry started to notice. Trade publications began writing about our innovative approach to international expansion. Conference organizers invited me to speak about emerging trends in global business. Industry associations asked me to contribute to their research on best practices for cross-cultural operations. For the first time in my career, my name was attached to my ideas. My insights were credited to me. My expertise was finally recognized as mine. Meanwhile, at my former company, things were unraveling. Without my institutional knowledge, Brenda was struggling to maintain the relationships I had built. Partners were complaining about communication breakdowns. Projects were running over budget and behind schedule. New market entries were failing because the cultural insights I had developed weren't documented anywhere she could access. She tried hiring replacements, but none had the years of relationship building and market understanding I had accumulated. They were starting from zero in markets where success required deeply established trust. The annual International Business Conference was scheduled for October, 7 months after I had launched my own company. This was the industry's most prestigious event, where the biggest deals were announced and the most important relationships reinforced. My former company had a prime speaking slot. Brenda was set to present their international strategy to an audience of over 2,000 industry leaders. I hadn't planned to attend. I had been invited to speak at 3 panels but declined. I wanted to avoid any appearance of directly competing with my former employer. But 3 weeks before the conference, I received a call that changed everything. James Morrison, a board member at my former company, requested a meeting. He had heard about Global Insight Advisory through multiple channels and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration. We met at a neutral location, a quiet downtown restaurant. James was direct and thoughtful, asking detailed questions about our approach, our results, our vision for the future of international business. Halfway through, he said something that froze me. "Evelyn, I have to ask you something directly. Were you the primary architect of our international expansion over the past 5 years?" I chose my words carefully. "I was significantly involved in the development and implementation of many initiatives." "That's not what I asked," he said. "James Patterson from Morrison Industries told me that when they needed help with their Asian expansion, you personally flew to Tokyo 3 times in 1 month to solve problems senior leadership couldn't address." Rachel Chen from Pacific Dynamics said, "You spent 2 years building the relationships that made their joint venture possible." David Kumar from Global Supply Solutions said, "You were the only person at our company who understood their regulatory challenges well enough to help them navigate government approvals." He paused, studying my face. "These people don't know Brenda exists. They've never heard her name. But they all know you." I didn't respond immediately. The non-compete contract I had signed prohibited me from disparaging my former employer or discussing internal operations. "James, I'm not able to comment on internal company dynamics, but I can tell you that I'm proud of the work I did and the relationships I built." He nodded slowly. "I thought so, which makes me very curious about something else. Brenda is presenting our international strategy at the conference next month. But based on what I'm hearing from our partners, our international operations are struggling significantly. Projects are failing, relationships are deteriorating, and we're losing ground to competitors in every major market." That's when I realized why he had really wanted this meeting. The board was beginning to see that something was very wrong with their international division. They saw the results, but didn't understand the cause. They knew the person who had built their success was gone, but not why or how. "James, I can't discuss my former employer's operations," I said. "But international business is becoming increasingly complex. Success requires deep relationships, cultural understanding, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions." Companies relying on outdated approaches or failing to invest in genuine partnerships will struggle. He understood exactly what I wasn't saying. Would Global Insight Advisory be interested in consulting for companies struggling with international operations? That depends on the situation, I said. We work with companies serious about innovation and adaptation. We don't work with companies looking for quick fixes or unwilling to acknowledge fundamental flaws in their approach. We shook hands, and he said he'd be in touch. 2 weeks later, he called with news that made everything clear. Brenda's presentation at the conference had been a disaster. She had prepared remarks about our successful international expansion, highlighting major achievements and outlining ambitious plans for future growth. But she had made a critical error. She had based her presentation on outdated information and had fundamentally. Brenda misunderstood several key relationships. When she claimed credit for establishing our partnership with a major Asian conglomerate, the CEO of that company was sitting in the front row and interrupted her to ask why the joint venture she described bore no resemblance to the agreement they had actually signed. He also wanted to know why their primary contact at our company, who had spent 2 years building the relationship, was no longer with the firm. When she discussed our expansion into African markets, 3 different partners stood up to ask why their contracts hadn't been honored and why communication had broken down so completely they were considering legal action. When she outlined plans for entering new markets, industry experts pointed out that her strategies ignored recent regulatory changes, making her approach entirely unfeasible. By the end of her 30-minute presentation, the audience was restless and confused. The Q&A became an interrogation. Partners were publicly questioning the company's competence, competitors were taking notes on weaknesses, and board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, 3 major partners formally requested meetings to discuss concerns about international operations. 2 clients initiated contract reviews, and industry publications questioned whether the company could maintain its global leadership. James called me the following Monday. The board met in emergency session, and he told me, "We're facing a crisis we don't fully understand. Our international division is falling apart, and we don't know how to fix it because we don't understand what we did right in the first place." He paused, frustration in his voice. "Evelyn, we need help. Not just consulting help, but someone who understands our business, our relationships, our challenges. Someone who can help us rebuild what we've lost." "What about Brenda?" I asked. "She's been reassigned to domestic operations. She'll manage our regional office in Denver." I felt a pure, overwhelming satisfaction, but kept my voice professional. "James, I appreciate your confidence in Global Insight Advisory, but I need to be clear. We don't do traditional management consulting. We help companies adapt to new realities in international business. If you want to restore your old approach, we're not the right fit." "That's exactly what we need," he said. We negotiated for 2 weeks, not just fees and scope, but structure and autonomy. I made it clear that Global Insight Advisory would operate as an independent partner, not a consultant taking direction from internal management. The final agreement exceeded anything I could have imagined when I signed that non-compete 8 months earlier. We became the exclusive strategic advisor for all international operations at my former company, with direct access to the board, independent budget authority, and complete autonomy over methodology and approach. We would rebuild their international division from the ground up, but on our terms. And Brenda would have no authority over international operations whatsoever. The official announcement went out on a Tuesday morning. Industry publications hailed it as a major strategic partnership. Partners and clients who had been concerned about our company's competence suddenly had confidence restored. But the sweetest moment came 3 days later, when I received a forwarded email from Brenda to the executive team. Subject line: "Concerns about external partnership." She questioned whether it was wise to work with a consultant with intimate knowledge of our operations, wondered about potential conflicts of interest, and suggested developing internal expertise instead of relying on outsiders. The response came from James, copied to the entire executive team. Brenda, thank you for your input. However, decisions regarding international operations are no longer within your purview. Global Insight Advisory was selected based on proven expertise and understanding of the relationships critical to our success. We are confident this partnership will restore our leadership in international markets. I printed that email and kept it in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. While Brenda had spent energy trying to bury me, I had built something she could never control. While she plotted to end my career, I created a business that made me more successful than any traditional employment could have offered. The partnership lasted 2 years and was incredibly successful. We rebuilt the international division, established new market leadership, and created approaches that became industry standards. More importantly, those 2 years cemented Global Insight Advisory as the premier strategic advisor for international expansion. We grew from a one-person operation to a team of 12, with offices in 3 countries and clients across 6 continents. Today, 5 years after signing that non-compete, Global Insight Advisory is recognized as one of the most innovative firms in international business strategy. We've been featured on the covers of 3 major trade publications, I've given keynote speeches worldwide, and I've advised governments, multinational corporations, and emerging companies on succeeding in global markets. And Brenda? She's still managing that regional office in Denver. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about recognizing your own value, even when others refuse to see it. For years, I allowed someone else to define my worth, take credit for my achievements, and control my narrative. I thought that if I just worked harder, if I just delivered better results, the truth would become obvious. But the truth is, some people will never give you the recognition you deserve. No matter how much you achieve, they will always find ways to diminish your contributions and elevate their own importance. The real victory isn't in destroying them, it's in building something so undeniably yours that their opinions become irrelevant. When I signed that contract, accepted those restrictions, and disappeared for 90 days, I wasn't planning revenge, I was planning resurrection. I was betting on myself in a way I never had before, choosing to believe that my relationships, my expertise, and my integrity would be worth more than any job title or company affiliation. And I was right. So, if you're watching this because someone has tried to bury you, if someone has taken credit for your work, or if someone has threatened to destroy your career, I want you to remember something. They can take your title, your office, even your clients, but they can't take your relationships, your knowledge, your integrity, or your determination. The most powerful revenge is becoming so successful that their approval becomes meaningless. Build something they can't control, create value they can't diminish, develop relationships they can't manipulate, and then watch as their threats become whispers, their power becomes irrelevant, and their names become footnotes in the story of your success. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or inspiration, or just reminded you that justice sometimes does prevail, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support means everything to me and helps ensure stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most. And please tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to destroy your career or take credit for your work? How did you handle it? What would you do differently? Because here's the truth. We're all stronger than we think, more capable than we believe, and more valuable than anyone else's opinion of us. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to stay buried. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next video.